This is a piece of racing history here in Daytona Beach. The last part of famed NASCAR mechanic Smokey Yunick's garage was gutted by fire tonight and is being called suspicious.
The date was May 9th, 2001, and with it, one of the most restless minds in American motorsports went silent forever. Smokey Yunick, the man Detroit's engineers alternately dismissed and secretly envied, died of leukemia at his home in Daytona Beach at age 77. What nobody quite expected was what came next. Not a sealed vault, not a government raid, not a mystery wrapped in secrecy, but a garage sale. An ordinary, almost mundane garage sale that turned out to hold some of the most extraordinary engineering artifacts in racing history. For decades, rumors had swirled around 957 North Beach Street. Fans whispered about outlawed engines locked behind steel doors, about NASCAR officials who supposedly wanted certain machines to disappear, about blueprints too dangerous to ever see daylight. The truth, as it so often does, turned out to be stranger and more human than the legend. Smokey's shop, famously nicknamed the best damn garage in town, had already closed its doors back in 1987. He'd shut it down himself, saying flatly that there simply weren't enough good mechanics left worth training. For over a decade, the building sat mostly undisturbed, a time capsule of a man who had spent 40 years finding the gray areas other people couldn't even see. When his widow, Margie Yunick, finally opened the place to the public during Speed Weeks in February 2002, hundreds of fans showed up. People drove in from Oregon, from Maine, from every corner of the country that still remembered Smokey's name from a scoreboard or a magazine cover. What they found wasn't a curated museum exhibit. It was controlled chaos, $5 hand tools sitting next to $20 boxes of vintage race car parts, stacks of hubcaps, a still-functioning 1950s GMC dealership sign, and Smokey's own battered manual typewriter. Margie described it best when she called the place a first-class junkyard. It was cluttered, it was disorganized, and buried within that clutter was some of the most advanced automotive engineering of the 20th century. One item advertised at the sale carried a claim that stopped people cold, a hand-built engine said to deliver 80 miles per gallon, priced at $20,000. It sounded like a tall tale from a man famous for bending the truth as easily as he bent sheet metal. But this wasn't fantasy. It was the physical evidence of research Smokey had been quietly refining for years, technology that had already been tested and verified by engineers who worked far outside his reputation as NASCAR's most notorious rulebender. That technology had a name, the hot vapor engine, built around adiabatic combustion. Instead of relying on computers to manage fuel delivery the way modern engines do, Smokey used a modified 2.5-liter Pontiac Fiero Iron Duke 4-cylinder and completely reimagined how fuel and air should behave before combustion. Where the stock engine produced roughly 90 horsepower and around 35 miles per gallon on the highway, Smokey's version reportedly delivered 250 horsepower and 250 pound-feet of torque, cutting the 0 to 60 time to roughly 6.5 seconds, all while achieving 51 miles per gallon on 93-octane fuel. The method involved routing the fuel-air mixture through an exhaust-driven turbine, sometimes called a homogenizer, and heating it through a wrapped manifold until it reached temperatures exceeding 450 degrees Fahrenheit. That heat vaporized the fuel completely, allowing the engine to run at an extraordinarily lean air-to-fuel ratio, something conventional engineering of the era considered nearly impossible to sustain without destroying the motor. Smokey didn't develop this alone. Working alongside him was Ralph Johnson, a respected Holley carburetor specialist and General Motors dynamometer technician, whose collaboration stretched the concept toward its practical limits, running exhaust temperatures north of 2,000 degrees to keep the process stable. Johnson himself later remarked, in a comment that has become something of an engineering folk legend, that these hot vapor prototypes ran their absolute best right before they failed. Together they built and tested several versions, a 3-cylinder Buick, a modified Ford and a Dodge Omni, each one reportedly exceeding 45 miles per gallon and producing nearly 2 horsepower per cubic inch, numbers that would be impressive by today's standards, let alone in the 1980s. Detroit came close to adopting it. There was serious interest in an S10 truck application, and a licensing agreement was explored with crane cams. But the project ultimately collapsed under the weight of durability concerns, legal costs, expensive manufacturing requirements, and what engineers often call not invented here syndrome, the tendency of large institutions to reject good ideas simply because they didn't originate inside their own walls. Detroit's own engineers had verified the numbers. The technology met strict 1980s emission standards without any onboard computer assistance. And still, it never made it to a showroom floor. The physical engines, however, survived. Smokey's daughter, Trish Yunick Brown, retained several prototypes within the family. A dedicated enthusiast named Tony Allers eventually acquired the running examples, restoring a Fiero using the salvaged original drivetrain and driving it as a daily vehicle for years, living, rolling proof that the technology worked exactly as claimed. On Christmas Day 2009, Allers donated that very vehicle to the Don Garlits Museum of Drag Racing, where it remains on public display today. Another unit is reportedly held on long-term arrangement with the Smithsonian Institution, a quiet but remarkable validation for a man who spent much of his career fighting institutions rather than being celebrated by them. The garage sale wasn't the only paper trail Smokey left behind. United States Patent and Trademark Office records confirm he secured at least 9 patents between 1978 and 1996, spanning fuel conditioning systems, oil change methods, engine testing apparatus, and even racetrack safety barriers. Patent 4,068,635, filed in 1978, covered a pressure venting system. Patent 5,246,086, registered in 1991, addressed an improved oil change process. Patent 5,515,712, from 1994, detailed engine testing methodology. And in 1996, he filed Patent 5,645,368, describing a racetrack incorporating a novel crash barrier design, a concept built on ideas he had been developing since the early 1980s, long before NASCAR adopted the modern safer barrier system that protects drivers today. That safety obsession traced back to one of the darkest days of Smokey's career. In 1964, his close friend and driver Fireball Roberts crashed and burned during a race at Charlotte Motor Speedway. Roberts survived the initial impact, but succumbed to his injuries 40 days later. The loss transformed Smokey. He pushed hard for safer fuel cell designs and crash protection, proposals that were repeatedly rejected by NASCAR founder Bill France Sr. Frustrated by an organization he felt was unwilling to prioritize driver safety, Smokey stepped away from NASCAR around 1970, carrying that unfinished fight with him for the rest of his life. Perhaps no piece of Yunick mythology has been more misunderstood than the legendary Chevelle that forced NASCAR to invent standardized templates. For decades, fans believed Smokey had built a literal 7/8 scale replica of the car to gain an aerodynamic and weight advantage. The measurements simply don't support that story. A true 7/8 scale car would have been roughly 10 inches narrower and over 2 feet shorter, changes so obvious that any inspector walking past it in the paddock would have caught them instantly. What Smokey actually built, using a trio of 1966 bodied Chevelles developed partly through legitimate Chevrolet engineering research, was something far more subtle. He shifted the body roughly 2 inches rearward on the chassis to improve weight distribution, smoothed and raised the floor pan to manage underbody airflow, lowered the roofline and window openings, raked the windshield back, reshaped the fenders and drip rails, and even reworked the front bumper to function as a crude aerodynamic spoiler. At speeds exceeding 180 miles per hour, those small, calculated changes made an enormous difference. When NASCAR inspectors tried to build measurement templates using a wrecked Chevelle as their reference, the inconsistencies were so significant that the sanctioning body was forced to introduce standardized roof, hood, and trunk templates across the entire field, a rule that remains a cornerstone of stock car inspection to this day. Driving one of these cars, Curtis Turner became the first driver in history to qualify above 180 miles per hour at Daytona. Smokey himself denied the pure scale model legend directly, both in a 1987 interview with Circle Track magazine and later in his own writing. That writing became his most personal legacy. Titled Best Damn Garage in Town, Smokey's 3-volume autobiography was self-published posthumously around 2001 through Carbon Press, working closely with his family to finish what he had started as his health declined. The massive set ran over 1,100 pages combined, packed with more than 400 photographs, split across volumes covering his life story, his stock car career, and his Indy 500 and invention work. Automotive executive John DeLorean even narrated the audiobook version, lending it a strange, fitting credibility from another man who understood exactly what it meant to challenge Detroit's establishment. The book also revealed a fascinating tension between memory and official record. Smokey claimed to have flown more than 50 combat missions aboard a B-17 bomber during World War II. National Archives records instead show he was drafted in 1943 as a welder and served on active duty from 1944 to 1946. Yet those same records confirm he achieved the rank of second lieutenant, earned an Air Medal, and served with the 15th Air Force, genuine, documented distinction, even if some of his own recollections drifted from the official paperwork over the decades. His verified racing resume needed no embellishment. 57 Cup Series wins as a crew chief and car owner, 2 championships, a 1960 Indianapolis 500 victory as master mechanic, and the distinction of being the first car owner to win back-to-back Daytona 500s in 1961 and 1962. He was inducted into more than 30 motorsports halls of fame, including the inaugural class of the International Motorsports Hall of Fame in 1990 and the Motorsports Hall of Fame of America in 2000. The physical garage itself didn't survive to see any of this fully appreciated. The property sold in 2003, most structures were carefully dismantled, and the last remaining building was destroyed by fire on April 25, 2011. But by then, none of that mattered. Everything essential had already scattered into the world years earlier, into museums, private collections, patent archives, and the hands of fans who had waited in line for a $5 hammer once held by a man who spent his whole life proving the establishment wrong. What Smokey Yunick left behind wasn't a hidden vault of secrets. It was open, verifiable proof that one stubborn self-taught mechanic from Daytona Beach had been right far more often than the industry ever wanted to admit.